Welcome back to our discussion, Overcoming Workforce Disruption Through Strategic Planning, sponsored by Cornerstone here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Steve Doborowski, the Senior Principal for Thought Leadership and Advisory Services at Cornerstone. Sherry Van Sloan is the Assistant Director of National Intelligence for Human Capital at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Bruce Gipe is the Chief Operating Officer at the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. And Chris Mihm, the Managing Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before we got to the break, I wanted to make sure that we are good with the question on that idea of bringing in skills related to the new technologies. And Sherry, I guess for the ODNI, that's a matter of that ties in closely with your recruiting tactics.
Yes, Tom. So we've done some serious investing over the last year, 2 years, on how we think about recruiting and going after that diverse talent pool that we're looking for across the country. So we've invested in some great tools to target those kinds of students we're looking for in those diverse areas, to target the kinds of studies they're studying, their experiences they're having. So we're really, if you think about diversity and the real core mission of the intelligence community, if we don't have a diverse workforce, we don't produce the best intelligence for our policymakers. So it has been a critical time to look at how we're doing that and invest in tools and technologies that allow us to really do targeted recruitment across the country. So I'm really happy with the intelligence community's efforts and really putting money where our mouth is when we're talking about recruiting that diverse talent that we critically need.
All right. And Bruce, what are you looking at in terms of the specific recruiting function, in terms of tools, technologies, and strategies versus the way it was done decades ago or even years ago with the standard online types of platforms?
Yeah, we advertise the way most people do through USA Jobs and do that kind of old school type of thing, or at least old school for the past 20 years. But then I'd say we have two other ways we do it too. Some of our recruiting, a lot of it is in-house for our experienced people, because if you look at prohibited personnel practices and disclosure, whistleblower types things, even though some other places do it in the federal government, I look at OSC, my unbiased opinion is we're kind of the best and the brightest in the federal government at doing this. So we have a really deep bench. Even though we're a small agency, we have a deep bench of people to pick from. However, when we need to go outside, I guess there's a couple ways we do it. First of all, we have an extremely robust intern program. This year, even though we only have about 130 employees, we had about 30 interns this summer. So we get these kids in law school, so they get good experience, we get work out of them, and then we get to kind of see the next generation of people we might want to hire. So that's really helpful. And then we have also used the Presidential Management Fellowship Program and tapped into that to get really skilled, sometimes the areas that are not our program areas, such as budget or HR. And so we have some of those employees who come and are part of our, we hire them, they're actually here as an employee, or sometimes we get them coming through as a rotation during the PMF program.
Well, Chris, are there best practices for that decision tree with respect to going outside for talent or developing the talent you have in-house? And I guess outside can mean outside of government, but it can also mean outside of your own agency.
Yeah, the general rule of thumb is that if you have a work requirement that's going to be an enduring work requirement for the agency, that is, core to its mission, that it's going to be an enduring part of it, it probably makes sense to think about bringing it in-house, with some exceptions, and that is if there's a pretty thick competitive market for the outside talent. So for example, like many other organizations, a large part of our IT function in GAO is supplied by contractors. But certainly the day-to-day mission requirements that we have, it's an ongoing requirement, that we find more efficient and more effective to be dealt with internally within GAO. One of the other things, and this gets to some of the earlier question, Tom, about recruitment strategies, is what we find is that if you're just showing up at the job fair, if that's the only time that, in our case, we typically recruit from graduate programs at universities. If the only time that you show up is at the graduate job fair, you're really missing the plot. You have to be establishing ongoing relationships with these universities, and including providing speakers for courses or capstone projects for the students, because that's really where you begin to start developing those bonds with the universities and identifying potential talent. We also have in the GAO a very aggressive internship program. In fact, somewhere between 2/3 to 80% of our new hires are people that had gone through our internship program. And then a final point, and Sherry touched on this that was so important, is making sure that your recruitment effort is really tapping into the incredible diversity of the country, and that we're bringing in employees that reflect America. And that also requires us to have an inclusive culture once they come in, because people can come in, we can recruit for a diverse workforce, but if they're turned off by a hierarchical or old school culture, they're going to leave, as they probably should. And so, because it wouldn't be fulfilling, what we need to do is make sure that we have a culture that is open and systematically draws on the talents that everyone is bringing and the experiences and the backgrounds. That's how we're going to be most effective as an organization.
Gosh, Chris, you hit the nail on the head there with inclusivity is critical. If we're not building that culture of inclusivity in our workforce, word gets out. And we're not going to be able to retain folks, and we're not going to be able to attract the right folks if we're not building that culture within. But one other thing I wanted to say about when you think about technology on not just recruiting that new talent, we're using things like virtual interview platforms, so folks don't have to travel to come to interview for us, right? There's a virtual way to do this, and we're using AI to kind of determine what that looks like for the best person for the best fit for the best job. We're using tools like that as well, so it's not so cumbersome on that new talent that we know that wants to use those kind of tools. But we're also looking internally to our folks inside that are already in the workforce, that are in the trusted workforce, the intelligence community. We've got to invest in them as well and give them opportunities to bring those data savvy skills that we talked about up to a level where they're competitive across their component, to make sure that they're being able to be skilled up and developed in ways that will make them competitive for new jobs that are coming at us. So I think we really have to take this as a two-pronged approach. It's not about attracting that new talent, because I think we've got a lot of investment and things going on in that space that I'm really proud of. But it's also, we've got to continue to develop that internal workforce up, because we cannot always recruit from the outside. There's so much goodness within if we just continue to give them opportunities and nurture that workforce that we have today.
And so, Steve, is there a way to systemize that decision-making? Where do we go with recruiting people to bring in for the talent we need? Do we try to reskill or upskill people that we have? And I guess in some cases, and this is true of private industry, also as much as government, do we just simply hire it through contracting? And is there a way to maybe make that decision process more effective?
I don't know that I'm going to be able to give you the silver bullet to that thing. I think that's an individual organizational component that you're going to decide what the requirements are, what the skills are that you have currently on staff versus what it is you need, and what's the upskilling challenges look like. Is it possible to upskill or reskill? There are some tough questions there. I think it's also important to hit on a couple points like Chris mentioned and Sherry followed up on this notion of diversity and inclusion. It's really empowering to see the organizations that are taking these initiatives seriously and incorporating them into their talent management initiatives. But we're seeing a movement going from diversity and inclusion to equity and belonging. And that's really empowering when we get into some of the conversations. And back to the point I make, we're moving to more of a talk, don't tell environment. And I think that has implications. And one final point I did want to make about some of the recruitment discussions that we've actually had. And I had this philosophy as a federal manager before, but it wasn't widespread. The federal government is primarily headquartered in Washington, D.C. And so therefore we've assumed that our talent pool is within the geographical constraints of Washington, D.C. Or whatever the headquarter environment is, right? So the COVID situation and this current environment has taught us is that our talent pool is much bigger. That notion of my direct reports must be in the same office that I'm in, I think is kind of in the rearview mirror as a primary idea. What this situation has done is it's shown us it is possible. And this is true not only for the public sector, but certainly the private sector, They thought that their profits were going to be gouged because they aren't able to perform, but they seriously have overcome. Talk about faith in the human capabilities and creativity. I just think it's an important point not to miss is that talent pool has become exponentially bigger because we're allowing geographically dispersed applicants to apply and maybe not be in the office so much.
Yeah, I think that we've all learned that different modes of working actually do work, and many agencies have reported. I've talked to a number of managers that say that their productivity is up, and they have specific metrics to show how it's up. And I talked to one very hard-boiled manager, leader of a component of a large agency, Army veteran of a career, who's completely turned 180 degrees on his view of telework and how that can help the agency. So maybe this gets into the even bigger question. If you roll that in, that kind of flexibility of where people work with the diversity question of do they feel accepted and can they rise according to their talents and skills and hopes and desires, that is, how do we make our agencies places that people want to work? And the third element, is Chris mentioned very early, and that is selling the mission of the agency. So maybe we can wind up in the time we have remaining with how do you make sure that people want to work here at my agency? And Sherry, will return to you.
Right, so that's an ongoing question and discussion, I think, for all of us. I think for the intelligence community, our mission is one of the coolest ever, right? We have one of the most important missions, I believe, with the national security umbrella, right? So mission continues to sell itself, and it will. But I think the idea that, you've got to be able to create that culture of inclusivity, making sure that folks know when they come in the door, they're going to be accepted as they are. They're going to be able to come to the table and voice their perspectives, their opinions, and they're going to be heard, and they're going to be a valued asset to the overall product of the organization. I think, some of the things we talked about during COVID with the IC Chico Council, which is all the, heads of HR across the community, is really, what we found with COVID, and I think we're going to see in the future is, technology is not going to be the stumbling block to create an idea where folks understand we're really leaning forward to find new ways to do business. It's going to be the culture that we build inside that's going to allow us to stretch. Because I think right now, and somebody mentioned previously, the culture we have today might be a little rigid in the sense of, telework or working remotely doesn't really work. I need to see my people at the desk every day. We've got to really move on from that. And I think culture is going to be one of the hardest things we have to crack, because I think that technology is there, it's available. We have to incorporate that and invest in that. And that's not going to be the hardest part. I think that culture that we build with leadership at every level to think about innovation, creativity, and really leaning forward to think about the future of our workforce.
And it's probably fair to say that the intelligence community has found, and some elements of the military have found, that even where it was absolutely axiomatic that you have to do this work only in a SCIF and only on site, that there are technological solutions to that even, and maybe not universal, but to some degree people can be a little bit more flexible, and therefore the whole work-life balance question, which can be difficult in that type of environment, has been maybe softened a little bit.
Great. So, I'll go back a little bit to the Right Trusted Agile Workforce Initiative, RTAW. One of the moonshots of that initiative is out of the SCIF and beyond the Beltway. And it really is thinking about, is the work we do really classified? Is part of that life cycle of work not classified? Can we do that work elsewhere? And if we can, let's get creative about where the talent pools are across the country. Let's tap into that in different ways than we ever have before. So I think COVID has really just kind of pushed us forward on this, and we're really leaning into, you're right, maybe not everything has to be done in the SCIF, and let's take advantage of that creativity out of the SCIF wherever we can. Absolutely.
All right. And Bruce, a comment?
Yeah, I think I already talked about OSC's mission and how I think our employees, it really drives them, and the agency punches above its weight, has a disparate impact on for the country and the taxpayers' dollars. What I'd say after that about having people wanting to work here is that I think it really starts with leadership, and leadership here has shown that it cares. We talked about the response to COVID, and I know when Henry was on your show, he talked about Wellness Wednesdays, where on Wednesdays, we've had yoga programs, meditations. Today we're having one CPR training. we've done things back when we could things together, like go to NAPS games, go to trivia. I think we've really tried to make sure our employees know that every year when we have the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, that we don't just do it and say, Yahoo us, we scored well like we did last year, but we look at what we hear in those survey results and try to make positive change based on that. And then what's always very important to everyone's work-life balance. And I think OSC does a really great job of that. I think COVID, once again, is accelerating that for the entire government.
Chris, we've got about 30 seconds left, so I will give you the final comment on how do I make my place the place people want to work.
Well, we've actually done some statistical analysis looking at the engagement scores on best for the Employee Viewpoint Survey. Many of the key factors or quick questions have already been discussed here. That is having meaningful two-way performance discussions between an employee and their first line supervisor, making sure that that relationship works. Having open, transparent, continuing two-way communication between management and staff, making sure that there's a balance between work life and family responsibilities, and then making sure that people have meaningful opportunities for input and that they understand, we all understand, the right to have input doesn't mean the right to prevail, but it does, what we are looking for, an opportunity to have input. If you create those types of cultures and in which you're basically treating people as adults, as we would want to be treated, you're going to be a successful organization. You're going to be a best place to work.
All right, good note to end on. I want to thank today's guests. Chris Mihm is the Managing Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Bruce Geip is the Chief Operating Officer at the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. Sherry Van Sloan is the Assistant Director of National Intelligence for Human Capital at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And Steve Doborowski, Senior Principal for Thought Leadership and Advisory Services at Cornerstone. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Cornerstone.